There is a major preoccupation about the results of development. Billions of dollars have been spent in the name of development or poverty alleviation or environmental management, and most people say where this money is allocated properly, where the resources that were engaged into the solution of a given problem actually effective in resolving that problem. Many years ago, we had very elaborate statistical methods to follow through and even a logical framework at one time to find out whether the intent of our actions attain the objectives of those actions. So we did a lot of surveys, if it was an agricultural project, we look at the agricultural output. We try to predict a number of things with the statistics, but I don't think that type of monitoring and evaluation that was behind that was sufficient to capture the reality of those development interventions. So I went into ex post evaluation, which is the second part, to look at completed operations, and I look at the bundle of around 2,200 projects and look into them from the perspective of sustainable development. And I found out that around 650 of them had something said, something stated in terms of sustainable development. The others, the evaluators who did the evaluation report, never look into the problem of sustainability. And I found out that there were many ways to project this term sustainability. One was this project is not sustainable because there was no money for operation and maintenance, for example. Another project is not sustainable because we exhausted the fisheries. We had a technology that was too large in relation to the fish stock, so we caught too much fish and then the fish population disappeared. Other people will say this project is not sustainable because there was no participation of the people. Simply it was a good idea, but nobody explained it to them, so the community became anti this development intervention. So I took all of these statements, and wrote them down. Every statement that has to do with sustainable development, I wrote it down, and then there were thousands of statements, I use a principal component analysis, to look at frequency distributions of this statement, and it came out revealing something extremely important, is that we could group essentially sustainability under 5 or 6 forms of capital. So one was all this statement that had to do with physical capital. The roads were not good, there was no enough of this or that for the infrastructure of development. Then we had many statements on financial capital. Like I said before, this project never succeeded because the government didn't put its counterpart fundings, or the lending was not correct, or whatever. So we had all these statements, line up into physical capital, financial capital, human capital. There was no sustainability because people were not trained enough. There was not enough capacity building for them to go with the complexity of this project. Then we had natural capital, which is the example of the fishery. Then we had institutional capital, and this is related to organization, is related to incentive structures, is related to the law, is related to norms and regulation, and so on and so forth. For example, this project failed in sustainability because the normative system was so complex that it didn't enable it to really function. Too many rules, too many restrictions. In the end, people did not do anything with it. But then we had cultural capital, This project didn't fit the community, Okay, we wanted them to produce onions, but they don't eat onions. So they wanted to produce wheat. And we said no wheat because it's not productive enough. Or we brought them forms of housing that had nothing to do with the way these indigenous people live. So actually some of them burned the houses as fuel wood rather than using it for housing proper. or there was a contradiction between the use of infrastructure and their animals. You know, maybe the animals did not fit within this environment and they preferred to be themselves in junction with the nature rather than adopting this thing. So the cultural capital was important. And finally, a spiritual capital. There are values and belief systems that people have. There is identity they have that this domestic development intervention violated, and therefore the project was not sustainable. So I found out that we had these forms of capital that needed to be in balance, and we also found that these forms of capital were interrelated. In other words, physical capital and financial capital were interrelated, but also physical capital and environmental capital, natural capital were related. The case of the Northwest Highway in Brazil, for example, that you put a physical capital into the environment and then major destructions, you know, take place in the forest, in human capital, in local communities, in cultural capital with indigenous people, and so on and so forth. So we tried to create monitor and evaluation systems, you know, that were capable to, in advance, not afterwards, to predict quickly what to do during the project implementation so that we could correct, you know, against the set of objectives and values that we had for those projects. This was a very, very complex job because you needed to know a lot about development, a lot about statistics, you know, and a lot about evaluation. And until now, I haven't found too many people actually who are able to do this. So one option is to shift the burden of monitoring and evaluation to the actors. You know, let the actors do their own form of evaluation. And this has had some success in some places, but in other places it's not been successful because the complexity of the intervention is such that people actually don't know how to operate. I have seen this operated successfully in projects of justice systems reform. For example, there are areas where people don't know their rights, but they cultivate the land because they have been there for many, many years. So how do you settle rights? And a good way to monitor and evaluate the transfer of rights is done by the community, because you don't want to impose those rights, because the traditional rights system might not be in line with the formal rights system. So it's much more effective that they monitor in the transfer of rights as a community than we monitor and evaluate the transfer of rights. So we did bulletin boards in the community, so they will publish, you know, they will give, let's say, a month or two for people to claim those land. And if they were not claimed, in principle, you will accept that that land belonged to the family that participate right now. So I think the future of monitor and evaluation is by integrating the actors in the planning phase, in the design phase, in the appraisal phase, and in the implementation phase, so they know how to direct their own vehicle, their own instrument, and so on and so forth, rather than having monitoring and evaluation from outside, from a different perspective than the human reality of those who have been affected. So that's the future of monitoring and evaluation.